So before the presentation, I'm gonna read a short statement. So all statements expressed by Fundação Getúlio Vargas employees and guests in our online events and broadcasts represent their opinions exclusively and not necessarily Getúlio Vargas Foundation institutional position. We also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participate in this event of their own free will, and they consented to be recorded in this broadcast, which will both be posted later on Getúlio Vargas Foundation official channels. Thank you for the presence of everyone. I'm gonna give the speech to Teresa, since she is the chair of the session. So the floor is yours.
Okay, everyone, so hello. So maybe we can start with the presentation of Carlos. And yeah, so.
Okay, so can everybody hear me? Okay, so let me go straight to this. First of all, thank you for accepting the paper, and hope this is preliminary work, although based on very ancient work by myself and Lucas Lima. So the title of the paper is Mechanism to the Household. Let me start with a quick motivation. So if you think about many of the income support programs in the world, they target the woman, right? Based on the idea that the recipient of benefit matters for the allocation. So in this sense, they are based on a non-unitary view of households, right? But this is practice, and in a sense, practice is preceding theory, right? And what we want to do is to have a model that is consistent with this kind of like real-world policy, and with the evidence in which these policies are based, and to address what can be done, what is the limit of what we can do with policy. So basically, my claim is that what we need is to have a framework for doing mechanism design for collective households. So let me break down my statement in two parts. First, what are the limits to policy? The limits to policies, what kind of allocation of resources can we ultimately implement? And we have the tool to do that, which is mechanism design, right? We know how to characterize a full set of implementable allocations. So the question is, the tools that we built to do this, considering that either people are single or that we can treat households as unitary, can we apply those tools for collective households? And what is new about collective households, there are two novel aspects. One is that we cannot simply assume that they behave as rational agents. For those who watched Chiapori's presentation yesterday, like the evidence against this is overwhelming, right? But even more than that, even if we could, like if households, even if they behave as if they were rational, that is, if they respected the strong axioms of revealed preferences, still, based on the individual, the methodological individualism, this would mean that this framework is not suitable, that treating choices as a guide, as a normative guide is not reasonable. right? Because basically we need not agree with, let's say, with the choices that the distribution of power within the house. And this is the key thing of what we're going to do here, is that power responds to policy, and this will be important for the questions that we're going to answer. So what we do, we develop a framework that allows for doing mechanism design for multi-person households. Then we derive the relation principle for this framework, and then we prove that the taxation principle fails. And this will be very important for the kind of policies that we think about. I'm gonna, if I have the time, I'm gonna show some tentative quantitative assessment. I'm not sure if I'll be able to do it, but if I can, I'm gonna show some preliminary quantitative results. Let me give you an intuition why the taxation principle fails and the overall results that I get here. So I'm gonna think about household choices as following a Nash bargain, and that is the way I'm gonna think about the collective households is that I'm gonna think about a household that chooses following like a bargaining procedure, right? Under this framework, the mechanism must at the same time handle the fact that households choose for like according to this, let's say, preferences, which is the Nash product, right? But at the same time, the mechanism will influence those preferences through its impact on the threat points, right? Now, think about decentralizing an allocation using a single budget set. So the budget set must do two things at the same time, which is like inducing those choices based on those preferences and manipulating those preferences through the impact on threat points. And this is too much work for a single budget set to do. And we're going to show how general mechanism can do that. Okay, that's it for motivation. Let me go straight to the environment. I mean everything that every paper that I cite here will be in the bibliography at the end of the presentation. But so let me go straight to the environment. So the economy will have a continuum of agents of two genders, like males and females, and they may be single or married. This choice, the distribution of married and single, and of who marries whom, is going to be endogenous to the model. But for now, let's start thinking about an economy where people are already arranged in different households. So single agents derive utility from the consumption of commodities. That's in a Beckerian sense of the word. And commodities are produced combining their endowments with the transactions that they make in the market, right? And endowments in technology are going to be parameterized by omega I, which belong to a finite set omega. Just clear this out. So we're going to capture this technology for transforming transactions into consumption goods with a transformation function, and saying that whatever is feasible is the transformation function will also associate with a non-positive number, and what is not feasible with a positive number. The other thing, so I'm going to use the typical convention that positive entries in the transaction are things that the individual buys or the household buys, and negative entries are things that the household sells. We assume that the preferences are represented by utility function, the details of which don't matter that much. Now, a consumption plan for, oh, sorry, this should be married agents. So for married agents, this is a typo. Think about a married woman. She derives utility from her consumption bundle. We can extend this to allow for externalities, but to simplify the presentation, I'm gonna focus on the case when there's no externalities. And her characteristics. The same thing for a married man. The technology, however, for converting transactions in endowments and endowments in commodities now is a joint technology. So here we want to capture public goods, household productions, everything in through this joint technology that the household has. The other thing, a person's life will have two stages. The first stage is the marriage market stage, where the person will decide whether to marry and whom to marry. The second stage, let's say it's adult life. The person, I'm not claiming that single are not adults, but that's just to simplify. That people choose either alone or as a couple, the transactions they're going to make with the market, how to combine the goods acquired through transactions, and how to share the goods produced within the household. So let me give you a simple example if you want to have in mind like what I intend with this abstract setting. It's like, so imagine a Merle's economy in which people do like the commodity sets like are consumption goods and leisure. The endowment is 0 units of consumption good, 1 unit of leisure, and then the parameter omega I here is now it's not a vector, it's a single parameter, and it defines how costly it is to produce Y. And then you have the budget set, so the amount of consumption goods and leisure that the person can consume depends on what she produces, the tax system in place, and her productivity. Now, for married people, then the things become a little tricky, because now the distinction between what you consume and the transactions that you make become important, because we're going to define two types of goods: those that are assignable and those that are not assignable. So, for instance, when we observe the transactions that the couple has, the amount of goods that a household has to consume, we cannot tell whether it's being consumed.
Sorry, you have 2 minutes.
2 minutes? Oh, wow. Oh, wow, I barely began. So let me rush through it. I'm going to be really quick here. Because, okay, so there'll be a information symmetry regarding both the characteristics and the transactions. Oh shit. Households would be in two states. They can be an agreement or disagreement. The disagreement state defines threat points, and which will define the preferences of the household. Let me go very, very quickly to explain what is a crucial assumption that I make. So we're going to assume that, let me go straight to what is a crucial assumption that I make. So what is a mechanism? Mechanism would define a choice set for each spouse in a function mapping choices into transactions. The crucial assumption for my framework is the following: that the utility that spouses obtain off the equilibrium, in other words, in the disagreement game, depends only on the transaction, but not on the specific mechanism that led to those transactions. Now, if this is the case, we are able to prove that the revelation principle is valid. In other words, any allocation can be characterized by a direct mechanism, can be implemented by a direct mechanism, and we can use this to fully characterize the whole set of implementable allocations. We then prove that the taxation principle is not valid, and let me really quickly explain why. Think about, like, let's say you have a tax system and you're inducing like a certain choice, which is this point here. This depends on the threat points that you were given, like that the tax system induces. Now, think that the mechanism can also pin down, in a sense, for instance, if you offer another choice set for the agents that they will never pick, but that matters if they are ever in disagreement, then you can move those threat points, and by moving the threat points, you can change their choices. In this case, in this example, what this would do would bring a more equitable distribution of utility within the house. In another example, I show that this can also reduce the elasticity of taxable income and probably improve the whole system. Now, one thing that we did, and it's the last comment that I'm going to make, is that we also, a nice thing that we've done in the last version is that we can be agnostic, a little bit agnostic about the marriage markets, and take a very general framework in which we incorporate the extremes of non-transferable utility, which is like a bargaining measure approach, in which you have a full separation between the transaction stage and the marriage market stage, and in the other extreme, a full commitment case in which all the distribution of power is distributed is defined at the marriage market. The general case, like we have some commitment but not complete commitment, and what we show is that the results are valid in all but this extreme here. So sorry, I missed completely the timing, but that's about it. Thank you.
And so I think we now go to Egor. You're the one discussing, right? Is he frozen or is me?
I think he's frozen.
Okay, so I'm about to share my screen. Here, yes. So thank you, everyone. I'll try to complement the Carlos talk, given that we have such a time restrictions. All right, thank you. So let me briefly, in less than 5 minutes, try to discuss this great paper by Carlos and Lucas. All right, so taking the stock. So the goal of this paper is to develop an extension of Milesian framework for environment with collective households. Hence, if we try to place this paper in the literature, here we take like 2 fundamental papers by James Mirrlees and Pierre-André 1988 paper. So the main results are threefold. So first, Carlos and Lucas, they build a model of collective household behavior, but importantly, they build a model that allows comparing outcomes across various institutional settings, which is crucial for the purposes of their paper. So then, thinking about the mechanism design part, so they first prove that the within household power distribution between spouses, it doesn't matter for the relation principle. The relation principle is valid, they prove it. So and hence, like for this to hold, they just define the spousal types in some specific manner that I will discuss later, and then they prove that the relation principle is valid. So, however, the intra-household power distribution matters if we think about the taxation principle, if we think about decentralization of the optimal allocations. So, and they show that if there is some changes in environment that follow the marriage stage, which can we naturally think about it, hold in reality. So if this inter-household allocation changes due to the change in environment following the marriage stage, then the taxation principle doesn't hold. So these are the broad picture. Turning to environment, so they look at the kind of pretty standard setup, the economy populated by continuum of individuals who can be either married or single. So the life cycle is includes two stages. At the first stage, the individuals decide whether to marry someone or not, so the marriage market. And then at the second stage, individuals do all the transactions, decide what to produce, what to consume, and how to allocate the goods between each other within the couples. So the key in their approach is that modeling the agreement between the couples via Nash bargaining, but threat points in their framework, they can be affected, they're not fixed, they can be affected by changes in the environment after marriage. So the private information, which is the key of the, if we think about the optimal policies in the Milesian framework, so comes from two sources. First, individual types, like in standard Milesian models, and also allocation of goods within couples. So as a planner, I don't know how the goods are allocated between the men and women within the couple. So revelation principle, as I said, is valid if you define the married person's type as own productivity, productivity of a spouse, and whether the spouses are in agreement or not. However, the taxation principle doesn't hold. And as I said, that so this result that doesn't hold because they allow for pretty much general changes in the environment following the marriage. However, if we take some extreme when the bargaining power is fixed following the marriage, like in the George Levy Gale and his author paper, so then the taxation principle may hold, but this is some extreme case. So what are the insights from this paper about the question of optimal taxation of couples? So before reading this paper, I actually didn't know that many studies that use a collective approach, the combined collective approach with Milesian approach. One is the paper that Cassiano will present later, and a couple of papers.
Just have 1 minute, so.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I have 4 slides. Yeah. So, and the other two papers by Immerwohl and Coulthers and Kramer and Coulthers, who model the couples extensive margin, intensive margin. So the main idea from these 2 papers, older papers, is that it really matters how you model the choices of the couples. If you model it as intensive margin, so then your results may be crucially different from whether you model just intensive. The question about optimal taxation of couples faces a really difficult, challenging task with dealing with multidimensional screening problem. And this is like the thing that Cassiano will address in his paper. It's a challenging task. And then the question is that following if we try to tackle the multidimensional screening problem and optimal taxation of couples, how do policy implications change when we allow for collective model? So whether the result from Cleven-Kreiner and Sayers, Cleven and Kreiner about the negative jointness will hold or not. So how to tax spouses jointly or separately? What's the optimal progressivity? So furthermore, an interesting insight about the taxes and the marriage and commitment topics is that how about the changes in divorce law? Does the changes in divorce law affect the distribution of power between spouses, and then how it affects the optimal taxation? So overall, last 15 seconds. So there's a great paper, highly relevant question, pretty rich in general framework, makes me and the other readers think harder about how to design the tax and transfer policy for married couples. Here, I point out married with a question mark is because there is another trend that you can observe in some countries, for example, in the US, a rise in cohabitation. So, and then it really matters for the tax code, the current tax code, whether you cohabiting couple or a married couple. So cohabiting couples, they may have other threat points. They definitely have other threat points. They may have other distribution of power. So this can also have implications for the mechanism design in this case. And also this thinking even more broadly, this leaves the scope for other policy implications, for example, partnerships. In this case, full commitment assumption may look a bit more justifiable because of the law enforcement in the partnerships. But yeah, this is also subject to discussion, and it's really an open question how this framework can be applied to the other environments. Thank you very much. I'm wrapping up and giving the floor for the next speaker. Thank you.
Okay, Cassiano, we are a bit late. I should be more assertive, Chair, but okay, so I will count 15 minutes from now, okay?
Okay, can you guys see my screen? Okay, this is a paper that was done with Carlos that just presented, Felipe Lobel from Berkeley and Humberto Moreira from EPGE, FTV. And for those that were here yesterday and saw Pierre Andre's talk, he basically, in my view, he advocates a lot for the usage of the collective approach to explain how the behavior of families in a multi-person environment is done. And why we do in this paper, we take this collective approach to the analysis of redistributive policies. And this collective approach, it acknowledges that the economic resources as well as the well-being, it's not in general distributed evenly among all family members. And we are going to take this consideration to the study of non-linear labor income taxes, where there is going to be multi-person households. We are going to do that in an environment that's Milesian, that we are going to augment to have couples. And in this exercise, we are able to answer the questions of sorts like, what are going to be the impacts of family decision making on the possible characteristics of an optimal tax system, and also how can a government use tax instruments to influence the decisions that I take within a family context, and to reduce ultimately and to try to tackle intra-household inequality. Okay, taking this collective approach is going to change things in the analysis in three different spheres. First, in a normative sense, there will be no reason why the households and the government's assessments of well-being should be exactly the same. And we are going to show in this paper that inter-household inequality together with utilitarianism at the individual level is going to lead in general to a misalignment between the objectives that households and governments are trying to pursue. And we are going to call this state as dissonance. It's also going to have impacts of a positive nature in the sense that it's very different to consider the behavioral responses to tax when we're looking to couples that can subsidize it and give insurance to each other, and comparing to situations where we are looking only to single individuals. And that's, as was pointed out before by Carlos and also by Egor, dealing with couples, it raises a lot of technical difficulties because there is more than one person, so multidimensionality is something that emerges naturally, and the tools that we usually have to deal with these problems are much harder, and they do not usually apply. And we show in this paper that for an important class of preference, the multidimensionality of the screening problem is going to endogenously collapse, and we can solve the problem as if it were a single dimensional problem. Without further ado, let's see the model. We have a static model, continuum of households. Each household have two spouses. Each spouse will supply labor to earn income, labor LI, to earn income ZI, and the income generated is going to depend on W why that's the labor market productivity of that spouse. They're going to use this income in the consumption of a good, XI, and preference of this consumption and labor bundles are represented by this utility function, U. As I told you before, households are collective in the sense that the consumption and labor supplies choices are such that they are taken to maximize a criteria of the following form. For some Pareto 8 alpha, and the multidimensionality that I mentioned before comes from the fact that we have three that each family is characterized by three different objects, which is the productivity of each of the spouses plus the Pareto 8 alpha. And this is, we are going to be fully flexible about the relationship between these characteristics. We also assume that we cannot assign consumption to each of the spouses, so the government can only observe the income and the consumption, the aggregate consumption done by the couple. The government is going to have a limited set of tax instruments, which is the government can only use a joint tax system that assigns for each level of aggregate income a tax liability, which also means that these tax systems they show income splitting, and the net of tax of consumption, the net of tax income is going to be used to consumption. Okay, so given this structure, oh, this part is wrong, shouldn't be here. So given this this structure, we have an induced preference for the household that's represented by this function V. And the important assumptions that we do here is that this the Pareto weight alpha is going to be exogenous to a changing of the tax policy, and to put our model in the context of collective models, all the decisions taken here are going to be efficient. Okay, the policy object. As I mentioned before, there's no reason why the government or society should accept the assessment that the households have of welfare. And let's suppose that that the planner follows the most traditional welfare criteria that we can think of. That's the utilitarian, but at the individual level. So he puts an 8 weight in the utility of each of the individuals in the couple. And if that's the case, we can decompose the utility of the planner as the household assessment of their preference, plus a term here that represents the disalignment between these two objectives. And we call this term here the dissonance. And that's a lot of reasons based on fairness and based on the necessity to have women's empowerment that can generate the same sort of misalignment. Now that we have this structure, the question is, given this object, what's going to be the tax system that the planner would want to set up? And we are going to look now for this in this presentation to a specific class of utility functions that take the form that's logging consumption and isoelastic in the labor supply. And for this class of preference, the induced preference for the household, it can be collapsed in a very informative way. So this function V can be expressed in terms of aggregates. That's the aggregate consumption, the aggregate income, and this function W here, that's going to be a sufficient statistic for all the family characteristics. So now, instead of looking for the productivities of each spouses and the Pareto age of the couple, we can use this variable W, omega, sorry, to do the screening over it. And the optimal tax is going to have this formula that is this is a most simplified version of the formula. That's the most intuitive one. In blue here, we have what we would get in a canonical Miller's model. And this part in red is the part that's new. And this part represents a given correction term that the planner imposes to the tax system to influence the allocation and to try to influence what's going on inside the household, because, that he do not have instruments to tackle directly. And that's the formula that we would get if we don't assume that the Pareto rates to alpha are the same across the population. And let me go direct this. This is an exercise that we do. We compare in 3 different scenarios, depending on the Pareto weights, what is the level of inequality that's going to be implied by the optimal taxes. I have to remember you guys that in this exercise here, the planner, the government has only very limited instruments, and we can see here, especially in the case that the welfare of families is very based towards male gender, the planner is going to use the instruments to the stream in order to try to tackle the inequality that happens at the individual level. So from these numbers here, we see that the inequality across families are taken to a very low level because he wants to tackle exactly this at the individual level. Okay, we also do in this paper, we analyze gender-based policies, and given all the structure that we have, we have a somewhat counterintuitive result that we should put a tax on the earnings of the gender that we want to put in a better situation. And this is happens because we remember the assumption that we did that Pareto rates are invariable to policy. So that's if that's the case, a tax on the earnings is going to act as a subsidy to the leisure of that gender. We also generalize our formulas for preference that are more general, and we do that using tax perturbation. That's another technique that happens to work in this case. And just to conclude, because I don't think I have a lot of time, in this paper we characterize the optimal tax schedule for multi-person households, and we put in the center of the stage here inter-household inequality, which is a topic it's usually neglected in the analysis of redistribution policy. And for a specific class of preference, we can handle the problems that arise from multidimensionality. And we show that the impact of having the dissonance, which is remembering the misalignment between household and planners' objectives, it's quantitatively important. And that's all.
Okay, thank you. So I'm the commenter, and so I just want to say I'm the least competent person to make this comment because I'm not a theorist and I'm not aware of the taxation literature. So I'm really sure that I cannot really say much, but yeah, just wanted to mention that before. Right. Okay. So basically, this paper studies the optimal design of non-linear labor income tax for two-worker households. Basically, looks how government can redistribute between households to also achieve redistribution within households. This was at least what I understood, and that it mostly focused on the case of joint taxation, even though in the end it also does gender-based taxation, and it uses a collective approach. And this is important because the bargaining weights affect the redistribution within the household. Some of the main issues when looking at sort of this, looking at household taxation versus single is that spousal individual consumption is not observed, only joint consumption is observed. And there is, in the case of the collective model, rather than looking at the unitary, is that there is a misalignment between the household and the government objective, which is called dissonance. And basically, so the social welfare function is defined over individual utilities rather than family utilities. And the government might put different welfare weights on spouses than the bargaining weights in the interfamily allocation problem. And basically, the problem arises because there is a difference between the welfare weights and the bargaining weights. And so the government will want to distort the marginal taxes to sort of influence the decision of labor supply within the family and hence affect the well-being of individual spouses. Some of the restrictions imposed in the models is that preferences are identical and isoelastic, bargaining, and that bargaining weights are exogenous, so not affected by policies, and it's focused on the case of joint taxation. So basically, from what I understood is that when the social weights equal the Pareto weights, there is no dissonance, and so we are in the classic Merlis tax. But when the Pareto weights are different from the social weights, so when there is dissonance, there will be more distortions on joint income through taxes and subsidies. The paper also does some extensions on gender-based taxation and considers the case of gender-based taxation with spouses when the spouse bargaining weight is affected by share of household income. and use the tax preservation approach to derive ultimate tax from restrictions and preferences. So I don't have time. So I think that I had these 2 slides, but basically when reading the paper in the beginning, it was not very clear what the contribution were, like how exactly distinguished was from the other studies on collective, when study taxation in the case of collective. So what exactly it's new about the outcomes and the conclusion of the joint taxation exercise is not really clear. While in the case of the gender policies, it was very clear that sort of the tax on the work of the spouse sort of works as a subsidy to leisure. Was not very clear how the mechanics work in the case of joint taxation and how the government taxes were affecting the interlocation of spouses. So for example, in the numerical exercise, you say that the bargaining weight affects a more productive spouse, but it's not specified which is more productive. So I just thought that the mechanics overall, in the case of the joint taxation, I got to the end without really understanding how the within household redistribution works through sort of the taxation scheme. And I think I will just stop sharing, and Egor, you maybe can start.
Thanks for the comments, Teresa.
Okay. All right. Okay. So let me start my watches just to be in time. Okay. Thank you everyone for hosting and for attending this wonderful session. I want to talk about the project with this long title, Welfare Effects of the Labor Income Tax Changes on Married Couples, a Sufficient Statistics Approach. So why income taxation of couples is an important question? Well, there are several reasons. Let me just list some of them. The first, scope. Scope is important because married couples in all the countries represent a sizable share of the population and the taxpayers. So if you take the United States, the married couples represent about half of all the households and about a third of all tax returns. Second, inequality. The presence of positive assortative mating, another feature that is observed in many countries around the world today, is widely considered as one of the driving forces of high between household inequality. Hence, it's very important to understand who benefits and who loses from redistributive policies such as income taxation. The third reason is that tax systems in some countries, such as Germany or the United States, they create sizable disincentive effects for married women's labor supply. The reason is that in these countries, the tax unit is household rather than individual, and hence the participation tax rate that we can define as a difference in the tax liabilities of a couple, difference in tax liabilities following the event when a woman starts working, divided by her income. So we can see that this participation tax rate are significantly higher for married women than for single women. Because if I'm a woman and starts working and have a working husband, so then the tax rate the marginal tax rate that I pay on the very first earned dollar is equal to the marginal tax rate on the very last dollar earned by my husband. Okay, so these are like 3 out of many reasons. So in this paper, I ask what are the welfare effects of tax reforms, income tax reforms on couples. In the literature, traditionally, looks at another group that is also quite sensitive to tax changes. These are the subpopulation of single mothers. However, there are 2 crucial differences between studying the single mothers and couples. First, the single mothers typically represent the lower end of the income distribution, and hence the very same tax and transfer reform may affect differently this type of individuals and taxpayers. And second, naturally, when we consider a household that is represented by a single person, by construction, we don't have potentially important within household interactions. All right, what I do in this paper? First, I develop a framework that allows me to assess the welfare effects of labor income tax changes on couples. So I built a simple model of couples labor supply that features both intensive and extensive margins of labor supply, and I derive a tractable expression for excess burden as a function of tax policy parameters, labor supply elasticities, and labor income shares. Then I use this expression together with the current population survey data and the NBR Taxim tax calculator to estimate the welfare effects of 4 tax reforms that were actually implemented in the United States over the last 4 decades. And then I show that these reforms created the welfare gains that range from minus 0.16% to 0.6, around 0.6% of aggregate labor income. I also show the quantitative importance of accounting for extensive margin of women's labor supply and accounting for spousal cross effects. Furthermore, I show that heterogeneity really matters. So, in the aggregate welfare effects measures mass significant heterogeneity in the welfare gains. Fourth, also looking at how welfare gains are distributed with income, I show that there are 2 interesting patterns. One is monotonically increasing patterns when the richer couples benefit more. That was observed in 3 out of 4 tax reforms, and U-shaped patterns when the couples who benefit more from the tax reforms are the poorest and the richest. The 1993 reform gives you, we will see it, I can roughly classify it as both. Okay, and then I also look at the different caveats to the approach, to the sufficient statistic approach that I've widely discussed. So I look at the various elasticity parameterization, look at how much the initial income distribution and tax policy matter. Also, I look at how crucial the assumption about the linearity in tax and transfer function that is also widely accepted in sufficient statistic literature. And I show that, well, if we look at the tax progressivity reform and under some assumption on the preferences, so the size of the bias in welfare gains is given by the simple and elegant expression, namely the ratio between the progressivity parameter of tax system and inverse elasticity of taxable income. And hence, we can roughly quantify the size of the litigation bias. All right. So let me jump to the model. So the model is quite simple. It's a static model of couples. I abstract from marriage because the time period that I'm interested in is roughly before and after reform, so it's quite short. So in this model, it's a unitary model, so where males choose hours, females choose whether to participate in the labor market or not, and then conditional on participation decision how much to work if they participate. Utility of capital is given this generic form. I model the participation margin with the fixed utility cost of work when the couple bears this utility cost in the case when a woman works. The budget constraint is given in this standard way. Here, I want to emphasize this parameter theta that captures the current tax and transfer system, and I will capture the tax reforms by a marginal change in this parameter theta. This can be any tax reform, change in progressivity, change in the tax levels, any. So 2 important tax rate that will matter for the final result, the marginal tax rate, but defined traditionally, participation tax rate that I have already discussed, defined as a difference in tax liabilities following the event when a woman starts working, defined by the change in the couple's earnings. All right, so let me skip the technical details of the model. So basically, to derive the excess burden and do some welfare analysis, we need to solve the expenditure minimization problems of dual learner and single learner couples. And then we derive the compensated functions, compensated labor supply, compensated consumption. A few words about the elasticities that are important for the final formula. I use 3 types of elasticities. First one is female participation elasticity, by how much the participation rate, the participation probability of a woman depends on the net of participation tax rate. Then the other 2 elasticities are male and female hours of work elasticities, quite standard, and also crucial for the framework with couples, across elasticity of working hours, by how much I change my hours if the net of marginal tax rate of my spouse changes. All right, so I define the aggregate excess burden from tax and transfer system in place as through the equivalent variation. And here I use a nice result from the statistics literature, is that here we can apply the envelope theorem, and then the behavioral response do not affect the expenditure function if we use the envelope theorem. And then the effect of any arbitrary small tax reform captured by marginal change in parameter theta on economic efficiency is given by the difference between the mechanical revenue effect and the total revenue effect, or as it's also called, it's equal to behavioral revenue effect of fiscal externality. So differentiating the aggregate excess burden with respect to parameter theta, I obtain this expression. The problem with this is that these objects are endogenous objects. So here we can see compensated labor supply and the compensated participation rate. So then I restate this formula in terms of elasticities that are also not, of course, structural parameters, but they are easier to measure and they have some easy interpretation if we think about it. So, and then the final result, we have a structure, we have a very tractable expression that shows the marginal excess burden as a share of aggregate labor income. So here, the nice thing about this expression is that we can first decompose it in different effects that comes from hours, that comes from cross effects in hours, that comes from participation margin. And also it allows to transparently see what are the determinants. So the red terms, elasticities, I will use the estimates from the literature, and the blue terms, the parameter, the tax parameter, the tax policy parameters, and the labor income shares, I'll take from the microdata and from tax calculator. All right, so let me jump to quantitative results due to the sake of time. So I consider 4 tax reforms implemented in the US, use the data from current population survey to be consistent with the model. I consider the subpopulation of married couples with working husbands, where husbands have strong labor market attachment. So for each couple, I can simulate the taxes that the couple pays using the tax calculator. So, all right, so one thing to note, to mention is that when we calculate the marginal tax rate and participation tax rate for women, so to deal with the self-selection of married women until employment, because we do not observe the earnings of non-working women, so I apply the 2-stage Heckman procedure to impute earnings and using the exclusion restrictions from the literature. All right, so having done that, we can calculate, I calculate the marginal participation tax rate, the series for them. And here we can see that, yeah, following in 3 out of 4 reforms that are indicated with gray, we observe the drop in both, except the 1993 reform. However, this series, they contain multiple results. Many factors may affect the macro factors, behavior responses, etc., etc. So to isolate the changes that are induced solely by the federal tax reforms, I do the following procedure. For every spouse I fix the real income, apply the federal tax liability before reform, and then take the very same income and apply the federal tax liability following the reform. And hence the difference in between these 2 tax liabilities will be driven solely by the changes in the federal tax code. So, and then I obtain the changes in the marginal participation tax rate, solely driven by the reforms. All right, so getting back to this formula, now we have everything. We have labor income shares, we have
2
tax rates. Perfect. And I'll take elasticities. All right, so as a benchmark representative couple, let me skip this. So this is the aggregate results, the first main set of results. And in the column indicated with yellow, we can see that the 4 tax reform created welfare gains ranging from -0.16 to 0.62% of the aggregate labor income. However, these are the aggregate results. And then I ask, all right, so how does my result are sensitive to the choice of elasticities? And then I consider different alternative elasticity parameterization showing how much result change. Furthermore, the aggregate result actually masks significant heterogeneity in the welfare gains. And here we can see that actually each reform created both winners and losers. This diagram is just easy to show this result. However, then also I provide some numbers that, for example, if we look at the 1986 reform that delivered the marginal, the aggregate gains, we can see that it created, at the same time, it created around 12% of losers. And also anyway, so each reform created both winners and losers, despite 3 of 4 created aggregate welfare gains. Then I also look at the how do the welfare gains change with income, and here we can see interesting patterns that in all the tax reform, maybe except 2001, there is an increasing, monotonically increasing pattern, meaning that higher percentiles of income distribution, the couples who belong to higher percentiles, benefited more from the tax reforms than poorer couples. All right. So then I also conduct some serious counterfactual reforms showing checking how initial income distribution, initial tax policy matter. Let me skip this. So, and finally, in the last minute, let me just briefly discuss another concern that I addressed in this paper. So, one of common assumptions that's used in the sufficient statistics literature is the assumption about linearity of tax and transfer function. However, we know that in reality, this is not true. So here I study by how much, what is the bias in the size, in the measure of aggregate welfare gains that is resulted from this assumption of linearizing the really non-linear tax function. And then using these quasi-linear preferences and the capturing tax function in the heat cost and Violante kind of fashion. So I show that the size of the bias under this preference and under this assumption about the tax and transfer function, it's given by the simple ratio between the progressivity parameter and inverse elasticity of taxable income. And we, from the data, from the empirical estimates, we can roughly guess what the size of linearization bias. And turns out that it may lie between 3.6 and 18% of the welfare gain. All right, so to wrap up, last 10 seconds, I built a framework to study welfare effects of income tax changes in couples. Then I apply this framework to quantify the welfare effects of actual tax reforms implemented in the US. In other words, it's easy to apply the very same framework to the tax reforms in the other countries. And I show how reliable are the estimates that I obtain under the sufficient statistic approach by conducting some sensitivity analysis. Yeah, thank you. I'll stop here and give a floor to Carlos. Thank you.
Thank you. Carlos, you can share your screen.
My watches show that I did it in 15 minutes and 40 seconds. Thank you.
Carlos, I think you're still muted.
Sorry. First of all, it was a pleasure to read Egor's paper, and the paper does a lot of nice things. And I'm gonna try to focus on the part that I think the paper should be improved. But let me just start saying that I like a lot of stuff from the paper, a lot of treatments of many different things that he did. I especially like the fact that he was able to put numbers on that using the sufficient statistics approach. So let me. So he writes a household problem in the Boskin-Shashinsky tradition, let's say, with the added fact that he has an extensive margin, which he proves to be extremely important to deal with to understanding the impact of reforms. Moreover, there's a very elegant dual approach in which he uses the cost minimization problem, defines the compensated functions, and since there's an extensive margin problem, you have like a threshold that you define, and a participation tax, which is interesting because it depends also on choices, because they are like depend on what the couples do in a situation where they're married, or I'm sorry, when they're both working, or when only one of them is working. And it leads to a bunch of sufficient statistics, which are important because, for instance, for the male, you have to define an elasticity for the case in which the wife is working and for the case in which the wife is not working. You have to define cross elasticities as well. Participation elasticities. One thing that for those who work in the area don't appear here is the income elasticity. And this has to do with the fact that what he does at the end of the day is to calculate excess burden. So, and these are the concerns, and this is where my main suggestions about the paper will come. It's because it's on the welfare metric, right? So let me go step by step here. First, what is the main criteria here? Is like everything is measured based on what happens to excess burden. But there's a problem here. Is like marginal excess burden is usually positive when you increase taxation. So maybe the reform is increasing the excess burden simply because it's increasing tax revenues. So when you measure it as a gain, can be in fact. So my suggestion would be to contrast it with welfare gains. We can talk with revenue changes as well. We can talk about this later. Also related to excess burden, then when you aggregate, use average excess burden. This is very controversial. It means that at the margin you're implicitly evaluating $1 each family equally. When I mean we distort basically because we think this is not the case. So I think that the emphasis should be in the distribution part and play around with different ways of weighing excess burden. Finally, this is a cheap shot. Of course, this is it comes with my own research, which has to do with the methodology and individualism. I don't think you should focus on that, but maybe you can have something to say about what's going on with men and women in this case. I have rushed a lot. So I have some small comments, but at the end of the day, again, going back to the welfare measure, what does QI capture? And this goes back to the point by the paper of Cladden and Saez, that if participation, the difference participation is because some couples are very productive in household production, depending on the welfare measure, this would be different from if QI here is capturing really the cost of working. And but then this would really play an important role if you try out different welfare measures, different ways of weighting the excess burden. So I really, so just to finish, I really like the paper, but I would let's say I would write it differently, just because I think the controversial part is all in a specific aspect is how you are defining the welfare cost of this stuff. But anyway, I really liked it, and I think this is a good future for the paper. That's it. Sorry if I didn't know.
Okay. Thank you. So I'll start 15 minutes from now. Okay, so I'm not doing theory and I'm not doing taxation. But yeah, so basically my paper is on migration motivation and ethnic identity of migrant couples in Germany, Tide versus lead movers. So basically motivation for this paper is that basically the challenge that migrants face with regards to their commitment and sense of belonging to a culture and society, which are defined as being ethnic identity, only became salient after migration when potentially origin and host country cultures potentially clash. And this might particularly be true when the migration decision is due to family reasons. Individuals might be more likely to experience a loss in the sense of belonging, a deterioration of personal relationships, and missed professional opportunities. So just to make clear here, tide mover refers to a family migrant who, if alone, so if single, would not have chosen to migrate. So it would be the case that the individual benefits from migration do not compensate the cost for migration, while a lead mover is a family migrant who, if alone, would still have chosen to migrate. So that has benefits from migration that are large enough to compensate the costs. So it becomes clear that tide and lead movers have different migration motivations, families versus work, and face different constraints and opportunities. And this is likely to be then reflected in different investment strategies and adjustment patterns in the host country. So here I plot just the raw difference between tide and lead or equal movers with regards to one of the most prominent elements of ethnic identification. So self-identification with respect to Germany here on the left, and self-identification with respect to the country of origin here on the right. And in the x-axis is the year since migration. So you can see that tide movers, which are here the blue line, are always less likely to self-identify with Germany, even with years since migration, and always more likely to identify with the host country, with the home country, sorry. So there is a growing literature in economics on the social cultural integration of migrants. The overall findings from this literature is that the culture of the country of origin of immigrants is somehow resilient, and even though some groups tend to converge to the majority, others display persistent differences even across generations. And one of the key insights from this literature is that adopting a new national identity involves social and psychological costs. So it's basically related to abandoning the previous identities, but then it also entails benefits, which are related to increasing prospects for social labor market integration. Most of these studies focus on the cultural adaptation of immigrants from different countries of origin with different residency permits or citizenship rights, and there is very little evidence on how migrating for economic or for family reasons might differently affect the cultural adjustments of migrants. Although, as we saw, these two groups have very clear benefits from adopting a new national identity. Sorry, I'm confused with this. And on the family migration literature and economic sociology, so Mensa was one of the first to recognize, and even if the family gains as a whole from migrating, some family members individually might lose from moving. And this Mensa model of migration predicted that the spouse that has less labor market earning powers would have smaller gain from migration, and hence would be more likely to be a tide mover. And at the time, these were more likely to be women. And later studies in sociology considered the role of bargaining power and gender to sort of explain why women were more likely to be tide movers. Most of the empirical research that has been done in this area is it's on internal migration, because it's easier to observe couples before and after migration. But there is some very thin literature on international family joint migration. And this tends to find that tide movers do tend to have worse labor market outcomes than primary movers, and that joint migration is not fully gender neutral. The reason is that tide movers are less likely to be selected on labor market characteristics. And this, again, is intuitive because, as we saw, their migration motivation is intrinsically different. They move to keep the family together rather than for improving their wages or jobs. So for the study, for those who don't know, the German SAP is sort of a household panel in Germany that has many waves and contains sort of these very standard household questions. And for here, I use this IAB SAP migration sample, which is a special sample of the SAP, which basically contains the main question plus a battery of a retrospective pre-migration information and post-migration specific questions. And particularly, it includes this question that allows me to identify who took the role of a tide mover within the couple. So it asks what played a decisive role in your decision to move here? Who was the driving force in that decision? My partner, so in this case tide mover, I was lead mover, both to an equal extent, so this would be equal movers. So in my final sample, I have 1,841 individuals, of which 106 are female and 835 are male. So for not all cases, I observe both spouses, but for the great majority, I do. And I also have a longitudinal character, but to start with, I will focus on repeated cross-section. And basically, I would mainly look at tide movers, and the reference group would be lead or equal movers. And the reason is that both lead or equal movers would expect to gain from migration as singles, so they would still move, while tide movers would not move if they were not part of the family. I also use the Women, Business and Law Index from the World Bank, which basically collects data on the laws and regulations that restrict women economic opportunities across 190 countries, and it's available for a very wide range period. And this basically, the index considers a lot of topics related to mobility, workplace, pay, marriage, and so on. And so basically a higher business and law score indicates that this country has more gender equal laws. So what do I do in this study? I connect two previous branches of research on ethnic identity and family migration. So in the first stage, which takes place before migration, I look at the determinants of the migration position. So who is a tide or a lead mover within a couple in an international migration setting. And then secondly, I look how being a tide mover or a lead mover differently affects the ethnic identity of spouses in their country, in the destination country. So this takes place after migration. And it is important to understand ethnic identity because it is thought to affect the economic performance of migrants, and this might potentially exacerbate the initial labor market disadvantage of tide movers. And furthermore, the ethnic identity of the first generation of migrants helps us to understand the integration of the second generation and the overall persistence of ethnic identity across generations. So here is just very, I'm not going to be very extensive. This is just sort of to understand the original frameworks. This is the Mensa human capital model. It considers a very stereotyped couple of a female and a male. Basically, an individual would migrate if the gains from individual gains from migration are positive. So the net returns, which usually are the difference in wages between host and home country, minus the costs are positive. And the family would migrate if the weighted sum of the gains of the male of the female are positive. So in the Mensa model, usually he does not consider any weight, so they're weakly weighted, but here I allow for weight, and basically this weight depends on social norms or extra environmental factors that affect the marriage market and hence can affect the bargaining power of spouses and influence the migration decision. If in this case, as the Mensa, if alpha is close to 1 and we see that the gains from the female are negative, but the gains from the household as a whole are positive, such that the family migrates, this means that the potential returns of the male are larger and considerably much larger than the gains from the female, so that can compensate the loss from the female and the family migrates. And so in this case, we expect that the returns are for the male are relatively large, so that the difference in expected wages between origin and destination country are large for the male, and these are a function of human capital. And so we expect the male to have higher human capital than the female. So just to make clear here, what I'm doing is that I'm not comparing those who migrated with those who don't migrate. I'm looking how does the couple make the decision to migrate, and then among the couples who migrate, I'm comparing tide to lead movers. And so basically for the empirical specification here, just to exemplify the probability of the female to be a tide mover, so is the probability that the gains for the household as a whole are positive, so that the family migrates, but the individual gains for the female are negative. And so basically to specify this, what I do is that the probability of being a tide mover depends on how large the net gains of the female are relative to the net gains of the male. And since the net gains are a function of the human capital before migration between spouses, basically the probability of being a tide mover depends on the difference in human capital before migration between spouses. And importantly, it also depends on whether it has a penalty or a benefit. So in this sense, if the net gains of the female are weighted differently from the male. And so here I equals 1 if individual I is a female, 0 otherwise, and S are social norm or other extra environmental factors that could affect the decision to migrate. And these extra environmental factors are proxy with the Women, Business and Law Index in the home country 1 year before migration. For the ethnic identity, so after migration, I use the Costa and Zimmerman framework to construct a measure of ethnic identity, which is very much related to psychological literature. And basically, these measures the balance between the commitment with the culture and society of the home and host country, and considers 3 elements. So the first is language, the second is future citizenship plans and location plans, and the third is ethnic self-identification. And then individuals can be classified into one of these 4 states. So integrated, separated, marginalized, or assimilated. So just as an example, an individual is considered assimilated in terms of ethnic self-identification if it's very strongly or strongly feels connected to Germany, but only in some respects, barely or not at all connected to the country of ancestry. While integration, so here's 1-1, it means that it feels very strongly connected to both Germany and the country of origin. And I expect that ethnic self-identification is associated with both pre and post-migration factors. So it's associated with the degree of exposure to the German society, with the home country society, background characteristics. And importantly, I expect that being a tide mover will be positively associated with separation, marginalization, and negatively associated with assimilation, integration. And the reason is that by definition, tide movers do not expect to gain in labor market terms for migration. So if the migration power of the lead mover is not disproportionately large, tide movers have a lower potential wage out entry to Germany than lead movers. And so these different immigration motives that we saw, families versus work, and the different expected earnings between lead and tide movers will likely have lead to have different incentives to invest in host country culture and different motivations to invest in family versus work. As we saw from the literature, adopting a new national identity involves social and psychological costs and benefits. In most of the theoretical literature, there has been proxy with investments in creating networks. So what you saw is that the cost of investing in the networks of native, which gives a certain probability of getting a job, which tends to be higher, is larger than the cost of investing in migrants network. And so by having lower expected benefits than lead movers, tide movers are less likely to invest in the native network. And the reason is that the psychological costs of distancing from the culture of the country of ancestry might not compensate the benefits provided by an increased contact with native Germans. So maybe I'll just go through this. So for the estimation part, so basically I have a system of two equations. In the first one, I define the probability of being a tide mover, which again is a function of gender interaction with women, business and law index, region of origin, religion, and if there is a children below the age of 7 before migration, which is thought to be a responsibility of the mother, and the gap before migration, so the gap in the human capital variables between spouses. And then when looking at ethnic identity, I consider being a tide mover, gender, age at migration, square years since migration, origin, religion, human capital before migration, human capital acquired after migration, household variables such as there are children, if children are attending school, and survey year fixed effects. And so the main issue here is that tide mover in this case is dependent variable, and then it also affects ethnic identity. It's our main variable of interest here. And so to identify this model, I need a variable that only affects ethnic identity through its effect on being a tide mover. And it's plausible that pre-migration variables such as the extra-environmental factors that affect the bargaining power, so the women, business and law index, should only affect ethnic identity through their effect on the migration position, and hence are good candidates for IB. So here, just to the main results, so here are the marginal effects on the probability of being a tide mover. So we see that gender remains a main determinant of who is a tide mover, so females are more likely to be tide movers. Women coming from countries with more balanced laws and regulation and hence have higher bargaining power are less likely to be tide movers. And in line with the Mensa model, if an individual has lower human capital, then the spouse is more likely to be a tide mover. With regards to ethnic identity, so as expected, we see that tide movers are less likely to be assimilated and integrated and more likely to be marginalized and separated. I do several extensions that I do not show here, so I include the partner ethnic identity, so we can think that if an individual feels less integrated and is struggling in the country to share their experience with its spouse, and then this might also affect spouse integration. I also consider federal state fixed effects and the role of potential migrant networks. Among others, I use the panel structure. I include the potential bad control with the employment in Germany, and the results remain robust. And interestingly, consider only the second equation. I also consider singles in my analysis. And I see that as expected, lead and equal movers are not different from singles and these single migrants. And so these are all individuals who, again, if alone, would have expected to gain from migration, and tide movers remain different. So the conclusion is that gender remains a main determinant of who is a tide mover within a couple. In line with the human capital theory, the spouse with higher human capital is more likely to be a tide mover. Extra environmental factors such as the law and regulations that restricts women economic opportunity have an influence on the relative bargaining strength of each spouse and affect the intra-household migration process. Overall, I find that tide movers are more likely to be separated, marginalized, and less likely to be integrated and assimilated. And the possible mechanism is that the psychological cost of distancing from the culture of the country of ancestry might not compensate the benefits provided by an increased contact with native Germans. And, okay.
How much time do I have to the discussion? 5 minutes. Okay. Screen. No problem. Okay, the paper looks to a very narrow research question. That's how migration position affects the social culture adjustment of migrants. And this is a very important topic because it's an important policy input. We can think that it's very important for the government or any one that's trying to come up with a social policy that would improve the lives of migrants, to understand better how the specificities of their working. And the mechanism that's fought here is that there is a decreasing bargaining power by the tide mover spouses, which are primarily women, that is going to after the event of moving, and this is going to reflect in poorer labor market outcomes, and at the end of the day, even less cultural adaptation to the destination country. So Teresa, how does she does that? She identified distribution factors in the language of the collective model. She identified distribution factors that are predetermined at the time of migration, and she will use those factors as instruments to bargaining weights after the migration. And this strategy is going to allow her for the estimation of the causal effects. What I like about this paper is that uncovers a lot of what's going on inside the family in terms of bargaining, and it's especially for this conference, that's a big deal in something that's close to my heart. And she's particularly documenting something that's not very usually seen, very not easily seen, is that the welfare of the family members, it can be quite different. And in particular for this paper, the welfare of the tide movers, female spouses, it seems that they are like super affected by the. It's possible that the aggregate welfare it's increased, but it's expected that the welfare for those spouses should decrease a lot. And results are quite intuitive. It's exactly what we expected. But I think the paper could benefit a lot to explore more deeply what are the mechanisms involved in that. And how I think you could improve that. It's I would look to what is actually happening inside the family, specifically I'm very curious about what's happening in the families that have children, because my intuition would say that a big part of what's going on, it's because of the women has to stay home to give more care to the children, and like the safety net that usually it's present at the home country, it's not available when you're after moving, and that requires even more effort from the mother to take care of the children, and maybe this could explain a lot of the results. Some minor comments. I was a little bit worried about that a lot of the results that you get could come from just demographics, but I think that if you have information, some kind of information on which cohort or each year those people migrated, it could help a little bit to tackle these things. And also, I think there's a little bit missing of convincing the reader that your needed exclusion restriction, it's actually valid. But overall, I like the paper, I like the idea, and it was fun to read.
Thank you, Cassiano. Thanks. So, okay, I think now we can discuss any paper we like. So I don't know if someone who didn't have time to, if anyone has questions, and if not, we can maybe someone who didn't have time to do their own discussion to continue now, or.
If I may, can I just make a quick comment to Egor, so that so basically what I was trying to say is that my biggest suggestion would be the following: to rewrite the paper the following lines. You have this way of measuring the marginal changes in excess burden. And as you have done already, you have done it by income group, right? Yep. Now, start with that, right? And then now you have, so my first concern was that the marginal excess burden usually is associated with more tax revenues. So you can calculate in each reform how much tax revenues you got for each increase in excess burden. So you can say, oh, look, in this reform, I got this much revenue for this much excess burden, and then you can say what type of weight of revenues in the hands of the government against revenues in the hands of the private sector would make this a good reform or not. The same thing you can do like across people, like take different inequality aversion measures, and then use all of them to aggregate, and then you have a bunch of results saying, okay, for this amount of inequality aversion, this would be a good reform. For this amount, so that's the only thing. I think I like the paper a lot. It's just that I would reframe it in this direction. But that was my journey. So since I don't know if the message came through in the first discussion, I took the opportunity now to.
Thank you. Just a quick response to this. Like, apparently, yes, I need to do this. Like one step forward, even though it doesn't directly concern the concern that you raised, is that when I compare the reforms, So simply when you compare the reforms, the welfare gains of the reforms in terms of the percentage of the aggregate labor income, is not a correct way to compare the reforms, because as you correctly say, so in one reform we can raise 10% more revenue. In another form we can raise 2% more revenue. So these two reforms will be not comparable. So I did one, like in one column of the main results, I compare the reforms is welfare gains per dollar spent to make them more comparable. So I was thinking about how to make reforms more comparable and taking into account how much revenue the government raised. Yeah, but as I said, it doesn't address the suggestion that you have made. So, and I will, yeah, I will think about it, what you have said, and yeah, we can talk later more if I'm stupid enough not to understand everything. Thank you.
No.
Yeah,
I really like it. Really like it.
Thank you. I have I don't know. It's not a question. It's more like praise or something. So about the Cassiano and Carlos and the other authors' paper about this multidimensional screening. So earlier on this summer, we were briefly chatting with Cassiano in another conference about this. And so recently, first of all, I find it very interesting, and still there are not a lot of papers that try to directly address the multidimensional screening problem. So some papers just abstract from some incentive constraints. So for example, I don't know, some type of couples cannot mimic some other type. Couples consisting of high school dropouts cannot mimic, I don't know, PhD couples, something like this. So that reduces the problem to unidimensional case. Recently, I saw a paper, I think it's a working paper in the European Economic Congress by Franz Ostrizek from Bonn. So they were also doing the multidimensional screening problem with in the problem where the externality also may affect also enters the problem. And we had some like brief discussion the way they also directly tackle the multidimensional screening problem and under what conditions you can reduce the problem to a unidimensional case. So it's yeah, it's very interesting. It's part of the work that I'm also doing, and yeah, that's.
Can you give us the reference, because this seems very related?
Yes.
Thank you.
And we were talking with him also, like the different ways how people simplify the problem. For example, there is another paper that I mentioned in my discussion to your Carlos paper by Chris Moser and Pedro Lea about the optimal paternalistic problems. So how they simplify a bit the computational part is that they assume that the objective problem of the planner depends only on one parameter, or one side of heterogeneity rather than two heterogeneity. And we were talking about.
Yeah. Pedro was I was Pedro's advisor in the master's program.
Yes, I think he has a longer last name, but I said just Olea.
Thank
yeah,
you.
I will. Yes, I will send the link now in the chat.
Thank you. I guess that's it, right? Thank you.
I don't know if anyone else has questions. I guess also we have each other emails, so you can continue talking or share the slides from the comments or something like it. And yeah, well, then we see each other on the.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you all. Thank you, Egor. Thank you, Cassiano.
Thank you.
Have a
Thank you very much. And, yeah. See you later. Thank you.
See you.